Joining us now, and I'm delighted, is hostage negotiator Gershon Baskin. Gershon, a very good morning to you. We have had many conversations on this station about the atrocities of October the 7th, Israel's right, the humanitarian disaster that's unfolding. Netanyahu, who I think back in October most people were saying, you know, we support what the Israelis are doing, two-state solution, etc. He sort of shifted ground recently, and international pressure, external pressure, has been brought to bear. Yesterday, he says, this is what I'm doing. Do you see him changing? Do you see the international community changing? Where do you think this ends, my friend?
No, I think that it is not Netanyahu who will change his politics. He has worked for 2 decades to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state, and he carries on with his indignation about anyone who would try to impose a two-state solution on the Israelis. Netanyahu will be changed. He will be out of office. It's just a matter of time before the people of Israel call him for his day of reckoning for the tremendous failures, the worst failure in Israeli history, in its failure to protect itself on October 7th. And Netanyahu was the prime minister, and he was responsible for that. So I think we will see growing international pressure on Israel to end the war, to have a ceasefire, to find a diplomatic way to put an end to this conflict. Israel's concern is that this war should not end with Hamas in power in Gaza. There must be work done on the Palestinian side with the international community to ensure that there is a legitimate Palestinian leadership, legitimate in the eyes of the Palestinian people first, willing to take over control of the West Bank and the Gaza, and that negotiations proceed after that in a regional framework to create the two-state solution, which must be the political end of this war.
Gershon, you're a hostage negotiator based in Jerusalem. How concerned are you about reports of tanks and heavy gunfire in certain areas where it's claimed Hamas are based, and the potential that these remaining hostages could be injured by Israeli soldiers?
There are 134 hostages still being held by Hamas. According to Israeli figures and documentation, forensic reports, 34 of them have already been killed. According to Hamas, more than 70 have been killed. There's no doubt that the military pressure on the Gaza Strip risks the lives, puts the lives of the hostages at risk, either from Israeli bombs and Israeli attacks, or from executions by Hamas people who are holding them. Every day that they're in Gaza is a risk to their lives. And now we're 5 months into this war. This should have been dealt with in the first or the second month of the war. These people should have been brought out, and Israel and Hamas should have arrived at an agreement that would have facilitated that. But there is a thought that Netanyahu is interested in prolonging the war because this prolongs his term of governance, and there's not a clear assurance that Mr. Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, is interested in a deal on the hostages because they are his life insurance policy.
And Gershon, how would you go about these negotiations at this point? I understand, you know, that it can be particularly tricky when it comes to negotiating with terrorists, with terrorist organisations. But what would your number one priority be when it came to negotiating with Hamas at this time?
There is a deal on the table, and because we're so deep into the war and there's been so many casualties on both sides, I think that we have to find the way to agree on the deal that's on the table. And the deal on the table is actually in the interest of both sides. It gives a 45-day ceasefire. It will bring back about 40 or 45 of the hostages, the women, the children, the elderly, the women, the wounded, and the women hostages brought back will include women soldiers, which is the first time that Hamas agreed to that. Israel will have to release about 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, including about 100 who are serving life sentences for murdering Israel. It is not an easy deal, but if it is clear in the reading that of the deal that Hamas put on the table, there is an ability to have this ceasefire without Israel agreeing to end the war and to withdraw all of its troops from Gaza, which gives us a pause and the ability for everyone in the international community and the local actors to try and find a diplomatic solution to end the war and bring back the rest of the hostages.
Good to have you. One final question. I thought you highlighted it really well. I mean, there's an outpouring, isn't there, in this country, not that we're that relevant, and across the world for a ceasefire. But somebody said to me something a couple of weeks on the show, a ceasefire only happens if the two parties want it to, and everybody can jump up and down. We can all look at that humanitarian disaster and feel appalled. We can all look at these hostages who have been held, whose lives were blighted, whose families were ripped apart on October the 7th. But you said Netanyahu knows he will be out of government if he doesn't stick to what he says he's going to do. And I absolutely make the point. You said it then. Hamas, the hostages are bargaining tools. These are people whose lives matter. So as well as it's massively important to be having all these negotiations, I am cynical because the two main protagonists in this war show no real signs. I guess Netanyahu says, I don't want to negotiate with terrorists. Hamas say, we don't want Israel controlling our lives. Difficult job, my friend, though, eh? For you? Difficult job.
No, it's not only as you painted the picture. We have two parties to a negotiation who are committed to killing each other.
Yeah.
So it's not a normal kind of a negotiation where you sit across from a table, you argue, you reach an agreement, you shake hands, and you both leave the room together. Here, each side wants the other side not to exist when the negotiations are over.
Do you think your negotiations, final question, can work? Do you really think there's a peaceful solution here?
I wouldn't talk about peace at this point, but I think that there is a way for a ceasefire and the return of some of the hostages. At least that needs to be done now. The Israeli army could also use a break from fighting. There are soldiers who have been on the ground in Gaza for 5 months now, who have barely seen their families, have left their jobs. We're talking about reserve soldiers. We're talking about the whole army is enlisted. And we're talking about more than 150,000 Israelis who are homeless, who live along the borders of the Gaza Strip and the northern border with Lebanon. We need to get back to some kind of normality here. And the first step toward that is the initial ceasefire.
And of course, 30,000 dead Palestinians and over 100,000 injured. It's vitally important that some form of ceasefire is brought about as soon as possible.
Gershon, amazing. Thank you so much indeed. Hostage negotiator Gershon Baskin on Talk Today.